What happens when a mother is sentenced to death for a crime she didn't commit? And what if, on the brink of execution, she uncovers a chilling secret about her own son? Keep watching to unravel this heartbreaking, twisted tale. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're from in the comments below. Margaret Bellamy had always been a quiet woman. At 65 years old, she had lived a peaceful, modest life in the small, quiet town of Millersville, Kentucky. Her days were spent in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, surrounded by the lush greenery of the rolling hills. She had been a teacher for most of her life, shaping the minds of young students and earning the respect of everyone who knew her. Life had been simple, a bit lonely since her husband, Victor, passed away 12 years ago. But she found solace in the small joys of a cup of coffee in the morning, the chirping of birds outside her window, the quiet evenings spent reading by the fire. But everything changed in one devastating moment. 10 years ago, Margaret's life had been shattered in a way that no one could have foreseen. It was late one summer night when the tragedy occurred. The police arrived at her doorstep in the early hours of the morning, their faces grim as they told her that Victor, her beloved husband, had been found dead in their home. He had been brutally murdered. The scene was gruesome, and the evidence pointed squarely at Margaret. Her fingerprints were found on the weapon, and the neighbors swore they had heard her and Victor arguing just hours before his death. Margaret insisted she was innocent, but no one believed her. It didn't take long for the accusations to escalate. The whispers around town grew louder, the rumors more vicious. The small-town community was quick to turn on her. After all, who else could have done such a thing? The trial was swift, and the jury didn't need much convincing. Despite her protests of innocence, Margaret was sentenced to death. The real twist, however, came after the trial. During the investigation, her son, John, had given testimony that sealed her fate. He swore that his mother had been acting strangely in the days leading up to the murder, and that he had overheard heated arguments between her and his father. Margaret's heart broke as she heard her own son's words. But it was too late. John had been manipulated by someone, though she couldn't understand by whom. Gerald Matthews, her brother-in-law, had become her immediate enemy, trying to convince her son that his mother was a danger to him and his father. But the truth, as she would later come to learn, was far darker than she could have ever imagined. Margaret sat now in a cold, lonely cell, a convicted murderer, and in just a few days, she would face the electric chair. Her body trembled as she thought about the future. She had been in prison for a decade, but she was no closer to understanding who had really killed Victor. And now, with her life on the line, the truth seemed further away than ever. Her days were filled with the oppressive silence of incarceration, broken only by the occasional visit from Ellen Foster, a fellow inmate who had become a quiet ally in her darkest moments. Ellen was a woman in her late 50s who had been in and out of the justice system for years, a product of a hard life. She had been a mother, too, though her children had long since turned their backs on her. But she had always been kind to Margaret, offering words of encouragement and companionship during her time in prison. "I know you're innocent, Margaret," Ellen would often say, "and I swear to you, we'll find a way out of this. You've been wronged, and no one should suffer like this." Margaret would nod, but deep down, she wasn't sure if she could trust anyone anymore. The years of fighting for justice had drained her spirit, leaving behind only a hollow shell of the woman she had once been. As the days passed, Margaret's thoughts turned inward. She had spent years trying to piece together the puzzle of her husband's murder, but something felt off. She had never believed that she was capable of the violence they accused her of. Victor had been a good man, despite the arguments that sometimes flared up in their marriage. No, she was certain that someone had framed her, but who and why? Then, on the eve of her execution, something unexpected happened. Ellen came to her one last time. "Maggie, there's something I need to tell you," Ellen said, her voice low and urgent. "There's a file hidden away in the prison archives. I overheard some of the guards talking about it. They said there's something there that could help you." Margaret's heart raced as she leaned in. "What do you mean? What's in the file?" Ellen hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the dimly lit cell. "I don't know everything, but I've heard whispers about a man, Gerald Matthews. He's been pulling strings behind the scenes for years. He's the one who orchestrated this. Margaret, he's the one who made sure you were framed." Margaret's blood ran cold. Gerald Matthews, her brother-in-law. He had been so smooth, so persuasive, but why? Why would he do this to her, to their family? Before Margaret could respond, Ellen pressed a small, folded piece of paper into her hand. "This is all I know, but you need to look into it before it's too late." Margaret took the paper, feeling the weight of it in her palm. She didn't have much time. She didn't know what she would find or how much of it was true, but she couldn't ignore the growing feeling that the walls were closing in on her. The next day, Margaret was led to the execution chamber. She was placed in the cold chair, straps across her wrists and ankles, her heart pounding in her chest. The guards moved quickly, efficiently. She could feel the electricity coursing through the wires, and for a brief moment, she wondered if this was it, the end of everything, the end of her search for the truth. But then, as the final moments ticked by, Margaret found herself speaking the words she had held back for so long. "I didn't do it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But Gerald Matthews did, and he made John believe. He made John turn against me." The room went silent. Everyone paused, even the executioner. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a decade's worth of pain and betrayal. And then, the final shocking truth emerged. Margaret's confession, the revelation that her son had been manipulated by Gerald Matthews, was more than anyone had expected. The room was frozen in disbelief. But there was one more secret to come: the truth about John. Margaret's last breath was taken, but her final words had set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the course of her family's fate. The morning after Margaret's execution dawned with an eerie quiet that hung over Millersville like a dense fog. It was the kind of silence that followed tragedy, a collective breath held by a town that had never quite understood what had happened to one of their own. Yet in the midst of their sorrow, something stirred, a whisper in the air, a ripple of unease. The truth about Margaret's death had not yet fully been realized, and the implications of her final words were too much for anyone to digest immediately. John Bellamy, Margaret's only son, had been present during his mother's execution. He had watched, paralyzed, as the woman who had given him life and love was strapped into the electric chair. He had seen the pain in her eyes, the betrayal, and yet, he could not bring himself to speak up. The truth of her innocence, buried under layers of lies and manipulation, had been buried deep within him for years. Now, in the cold light of morning, John was forced to confront the dark reality he had ignored for so long. He sat in the dimly lit living room of his small apartment, staring blankly at the floor. His hands trembled as he gripped the photograph of his mother, taken years ago before the tragedy struck. Margaret's smile in the photo was a stark contrast to the image of her that haunted his memory. The woman he had been told was a monster, responsible for his father's death. The lies that had shaped his life for the last decade felt as if they were finally crumbling, piece by piece. His mind raced back to the trial, to the moments when he had been coerced by his uncle Gerald Matthews, the man who had claimed to be looking out for his well-being, had whispered in his ear for months, convincing him that his mother was a dangerous woman who needed to be stopped. "She killed your father, John," he had said, his voice soft and reassuring. "She's dangerous. She has to be punished." At the time, John had believed him. What choice did he have? His mother had been distant, often withdrawn, lost in her own grief, and Gerald had always been there, offering comfort, a shoulder to lean on. Gerald had painted himself as the protector, the one who knew the right path, and John, feeling abandoned and confused, had followed. But now, with his mother's death weighing heavily on his soul, John could no longer ignore the nagging doubts that had haunted him for years. His mother had always been kind, always patient, always loving. The idea that she could be a murderer felt like a lie, one that had been constructed by someone who had known just how to manipulate his pain. Tears welled in John's eyes as he looked down at the photograph. The guilt consumed him, a gnawing, relentless force that made it hard to breathe. He had sentenced his own mother to death. The thought sent a wave of nausea over him. But it wasn't just the lies about Margaret that he had to confront. There was also the bitter truth about Gerald, the man who had puppeteered the entire tragedy. Gerald Matthews had been in his life for as long as he could remember, always there in the background, always pretending to be the father figure John never had. But in reality, Gerald had used his influence to manipulate him, twisting John's perception of his mother to suit his own purposes. The deeper John dug into the past, the clearer the picture became. Gerald had never cared for his family. He had always been driven by something darker, something more selfish. The more John thought about it, the more he realized that Gerald had always been behind the scenes, quietly orchestrating his mother's downfall. John didn't know where to begin. There were so many questions, so many things he needed to know. The truth about his mother's death, the lies Gerald had told, the role his own guilt played in it all. But he knew one thing: he couldn't go on living like this. He couldn't keep pretending that his mother had been guilty, and he couldn't let Gerald get away with what he had done. That night, John made a decision. He would find the truth. He would confront Gerald, confront the family secrets that had been buried for far too long. And maybe, just maybe, he could begin to make things right if it wasn't already too late. The next day, he went to the prison where his mother had been held for 10 long years. It was the last place he ever thought he would visit, but it was also the place where the final pieces of the puzzle might lie. He knew that the documents, the evidence that had been hidden away, were there. He couldn't do this alone anymore. And he needed answers. Inside the prison, the air was thick with the remnants of old secrets. The guards eyed him suspiciously as he made his way toward the archives. He didn't belong there, not anymore, not after what had happened. But John had come for the truth, no matter the cost. He met with Officer Thomas, the one person in the prison who had seemed genuinely sympathetic to his mother over the years. The officer was a man in his mid-40s, hardened by years of service, but there was a softness in his eyes when he spoke of Margaret. He had always believed she was innocent, even as the rest of the world turned their backs on her. "You sure you want to see this?" Officer Thomas asked, his voice hushed. "It's not going to be easy. A lot of this has been buried for a reason." "I need to know," John replied firmly. "I need to know the truth about my mother, and I need to know what my uncle really did." The officer sighed, then led him to a small, dusty room tucked away in the farthest corner of the prison. The room smelled of mildew and age, and the shelves were lined with forgotten files and documents, yellowed with time. Officer Thomas pulled a thick folder from the bottom of a stack. The words "Case number 4357 Bellamy," Margaret scrawled across the front in bold letters. John's heart skipped a beat as the folder was placed in front of him. He opened it, his hands trembling, knowing that this moment would change everything. Inside the folder, he found a series of letters written by Gerald Matthews himself. They were addressed to various officials, attorneys, and even the local media. The letters spoke of Margaret's supposed guilt, of how she had been a danger to their family, how she had killed Victor Bellamy in a fit of rage. But there was something else, something John hadn't expected. In one of the letters, Gerald mentioned something about his own involvement in the investigation, about how he had helped steer the case in a particular direction. John's mind reeled. His uncle had been orchestrating everything, all along. He had manipulated the system, played everyone including him. But there was something even darker in the letters. A note at the bottom of one of them read, "The boy needs to believe it was her, or all will be lost. We cannot let the truth come out. The family's future depends on it." John's blood ran cold. It was always about control. He slammed the folder shut, his mind racing. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. Gerald wasn't just after his mother, he was after the Bellamy name, the family wealth, and something far more sinister. It was all starting to make sense now. The truth was finally coming to light. But what was John going to do with it? He didn't know yet, but he knew one thing. Gerald Matthews was not going to get away with this. Not now. Not ever. John couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one thing was clear. He could no longer let Gerald Matthews control his life. The man who had been his guardian and his mentor, the one who had comforted him after his father's death, was nothing more than a manipulator and architect of a lie so enormous that it had cost his mother her life. The letters from the prison archives burned in John's mind. Gerald had known all along that Margaret was innocent, yet he had orchestrated her downfall for his own gain. The carefully crafted lies that had led to her conviction were now exposed. But they weren't enough to erase the damage that had already been done. His mother was gone, her name forever tarnished, and John, her only living relative, was left to pick up the pieces. John had grown up with Gerald, believing him to be the one person who truly understood him. After his father's tragic death, Gerald had swooped in, taking the role of protector, guiding him through the rough patches of adolescence. When John had been told that Margaret had killed Victor Bellamy, he had trusted the only father figure he had ever known. But now, in the cold light of day, John realized the painful truth. Gerald had betrayed him just as he had betrayed Margaret. But the more John thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. There were whispers, bits of conversation he had overheard as a child, things he had dismissed as irrelevant or childish gossip. His mother had always been distant. Yes, but she had never been the monster Gerald had painted her to be. Victor had been a volatile man, prone to fits of rage, and it made sense that Margaret had been a victim in that household. But Gerald's involvement in that history, his control over the family, and his role in framing her for the murder were things John could no longer ignore. The question that haunted him now was this: what would he do about it? Gerald had spent years weaving a web of lies, and now John was tangled up in it, caught between his own guilt and the desire for justice. He had no choice but to confront Gerald, but he knew that doing so would mean shaking the foundations of everything he thought he knew. It was late afternoon when John finally decided he could not wait any longer. He needed to confront his uncle. The letters had given him enough ammunition, and now, it was time to confront the man who had stolen his peace. As he drove through the streets of Millersville, a town he had once thought was full of warmth and comfort, John couldn't help but notice how everything felt different. The houses, the trees, even the air itself, it all seemed foreign, as if the town had become a stage for a play. He was no longer part of the streets that had once felt like home, now felt like a trap, a reminder of how easily he had been manipulated by those he trusted most. John pulled into the driveway of the Matthews family estate. The large, stately house loomed in front of him, a monument to the secrets and lies that had defined his life. He hadn't been back here in years, not since Margaret's death. Gerald had taken over the property, and after the trial, John had moved into a small apartment, trying to distance himself from the painful memories, but now, he was back and he wasn't leaving until he had answers. He rang the doorbell, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open, revealing Gerald, who stood there with his usual polished smile, as if nothing had changed. His graying hair and sharp features gave him an air of authority. A man who had always been in control, but now, to John, Gerald seemed like a hollow shell someone who had spent so many years hiding his true nature that it was impossible to see the man he really was. Well, John, Gerald said smoothly, stepping aside to allow him in. I didn't expect to see you today. Come on in, I was just finishing up some paperwork. Can I offer you a drink? No, thank you, John replied coldly, stepping into the grand foyer. He could feel the tension between them, the chasm of years filled with lies and betrayals. I'm not here for pleasantries. Gerald raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had always been able to read people, to sense when something was amiss. But John wasn't the same naive young man he had manipulated years ago. He had grown up, and he had come to understand the truth. I need to talk to you, John said, his voice shaking slightly despite his best efforts to remain calm. About Margaret, about everything. Gerald's smile faltered, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of unease passed across his face. But he quickly regained his composure, leading John into the sitting room. I'm not sure I follow. John, what's this about? John took a deep breath. It was time to lay it all out. To stop pretending he didn't know, he would not let Gerald twist the truth any longer. Margaret was innocent, he said, his voice steady now. You knew that. You knew she didn't kill Victor, but you let her die, and you made me believe she was guilty. All these years, you manipulated me, made me think she was the one who caused all of this. But you were the one behind it. You framed her, and you've been lying to me for years. Gerald's face hardened, his jaw tightening. For the first time, John saw a glimpse of the man beneath the facadian, angry, defensive side of Gerald that he had never witnessed before. John, Gerald said, his voice low and dangerous. You don't know what you're talking about. Your mother, she was unstable. You saw it, you knew what she was capable of. No, John shot back, his voice rising. You made me believe that. You made me think she was capable of terrible things. But I know better now. I know you killed Victor. You manipulated everything, including me. Gerald stepped forward, his eyes burning with fury. You don't understand, he hissed. This was never about her. It was always about the family. About the future. You've been too blind to see it. You think you can just waltz in here and accuse me of something like that. Do you know what you're saying? You think I'd throw away everything I've built for some sick little vendetta. You're a fool. John stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. I'm not a fool. I've seen the letters. Gerald, I know what you did. You manipulated me into believing my own mother was guilty. You killed her, and now you're trying to destroy me too. But I'm not going to let you get away with it. I will expose you. Gerald's eyes narrowed dangerously, and for a moment, John thought the older man might strike him. But instead, Gerald smiled a smile that sent a chill down John's spine. You really think you can do that? Gerald asked, his voice dripping with venom. You're nothing without me. Without the Matthews name, you're just like your mother, nothing. John's breath caught in his throat. The words stung, but they also fueled his resolve. He had come this far, and he wasn't backing down now. I'm not you, Gerald, John said quietly, his voice steady and filled with determination. And I will make sure the truth comes out. You can't stop me. Gerald's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. He stepped back, nodding slowly as if he were conceding defeat, but John could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. Then you'd better be ready for the consequences. John, Gerald said, his voice a low whisper. Because once this all comes out, nothing will ever be the same again. John couldn't shake the feeling that his confrontation with Gerald had only just begun. As he left the Matthews estate that day, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He had made the bold declaration that he would expose the truth. But deep down, a nagging voice whispered that it wouldn't be as simple as he hoped. Gerald had the power, the resources, and the manipulation skills that had served him for decades. What made John think he could defeat such a man? He couldn't help but replay the conversation over and over in his head. The venomous words Gerald had thrown at him, accusing him of being nothing without the Matthews name, still stung. But they also sparked something inside him, a fire of determination. He wasn't going to be the victim anymore. The lies, the control, the manipulation, they would all end. John's first step was clear. He needed to gather more evidence. The letters from the prison had opened his eyes, but they weren't enough to destroy the carefully constructed narrative Gerald had spent years building. He needed something concrete, something irrefutable. And for that, he had to dig deeper into the past. Over the next few days, John found himself obsessed with the case that had plagued his family for years. He combed through old court records, meticulously examining the trial documents. He read witness testimonies, each more twisted than the last. Everyone had been so sure of Margaret's guilt, even the defense attorneys, who had been woefully inadequate in defending her. John spent hours at the local library, going through dusty microfiche records of the trial. There was one name that kept appearing: Victor Bellamy's business partner, a man named Leonard Pierce. Leonard had been an influential figure in the local community, a wealthy businessman with connections that stretched beyond Millersville. He had been one of the key witnesses in Margaret's trial, testifying that she had been the one to kill Victor during a violent argument. His testimony had been the nail in the coffin for Margaret's case. But something about Leonard's testimony didn't sit right with John. It seemed rehearsed, almost too perfect. And when he compared Leonard's statements to the evidence, it was clear that there were holes, glaring inconsistencies that no one had bothered to question at the time. One afternoon, after hours of poring over documents, John decided to pay Leonard a visit. If he could get the man to talk, maybe he could find a crack in the facade of truth that Gerald had built. John drove to Leonard's estate, a sprawling mansion just outside of town. The mansion, though grand, looked worn and tired, much like its owner. Leonard Pierce was a man in his late 70s, with sharp, calculating eyes that had not dulled with age. He had been part of the elite circle in Millersville for decades, and despite his wealth and influence, there was an air of coldness about him that made John's skin crawl. When he rang the doorbell, it was answered by a woman who looked far too young to be Leonard's wife. She gave John a polite smile, but her eyes held something Mara guarded suspicion, as though she knew exactly who he was. "I'm here to speak with Mr. Pierce," John said, trying to sound as composed as possible. The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping aside to let him in. As John stepped over the threshold, he couldn't help but feel the weight of history bearing down on him. This house, this man, both had been part of the twisted web that had destroyed his family, but now, he was here to unravel it. Leonard Pierce appeared moments later, walking slowly down the grand staircase, his movements deliberate and slow. He looked every bit the aging patriarch, but there was something unsettling about the way he studied John, as though he were sizing him up. "Ah, John," Leonard said, his voice smooth and calm. "I've heard a great deal about you. What brings you to my home?" "I need to ask you about the trial," John said, his voice steady but filled with an edge of urgency. "You testified that my mother killed Victor Bellamy, but I've been looking at the records, and there are discrepancies. I need to know the truth, Leonard." Leonard's smile faltered for a brief moment, and John caught the faintest flicker of unease in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You've been digging through old court documents, huh?" Leonard said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "I admire your persistence, John, but some things are better left buried. I know that my mother was innocent." "You know it too," John pressed, not backing down. "You testified under pressure, didn't you? Your testimony sealed her fate, but now I'm wondering if it was all part of a bigger plan, a plan that involved Gerald Matthews." Leonard's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice now cold, devoid of any warmth. "Gerald has always been a good man, a man who knows how to get things done. If you think you're going to rewrite history by stirring up these old wounds, you're sorely mistaken." "I'm not trying to rewrite anything," John said firmly. "I'm trying to uncover the truth. You were part of the scheme, weren't you? You helped frame my mother for Victor's murder. And Gerald Matthews, he's the one who orchestrated it all. I know you were involved, Leonard, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows." For a moment, there was silence between them, a tense stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. John's heart pounded in his chest, his blood rushing in his ears. He had thrown the accusation, and now it was time to see how Leonard would respond. Finally, Leonard let out a low, bitter laugh. "You think you can come in here and change anything? That you can just accuse me of being part of some grand conspiracy?" His voice grew louder, more forceful. "You're a fool, John. You have no idea what you're up against. Gerald is untouchable, and if you think you're going to bring him down, you're going to find out the hard way just how deep this goes." John stood his ground, refusing to back down. "I don't care how deep it goes," he said through clenched teeth. "I'm not afraid of you, Leonard, or Gerald. This ends now." Leonard's smile returned, but it was dark and twisted. "You'll regret this, John, I promise you that." As John turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into a much larger web than he had anticipated. Leonard's warning echoed in his mind as he walked back to his car. But there was no turning back. Now, he had crossed the line, and there was no retreating into the safety of ignorance. The truth was out there, he just had to dig deep enough to find it. But with every step forward, the stakes grew higher, and the dangers more real. What had started as a search for justice had now become a battle for his very life. As John drove away, he knew one thing for certain. He was in this for the long haul. And no matter what it took, he would bring Gerald Matthews to justice. John's visit to Leonard Pierce's mansion had been a turning point. As the days passed, he couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled deep in his bones. Leonard's words kept echoing in his mind. "You'll regret this, John, I promise you that." At first, he had brushed it off as an empty threat, the typical bravado of a man with too many secrets. But now, in the quiet of his apartment late at night, he began to realize that Leonard wasn't just a man trying to protect himself. He was a part of something much larger, something that could bring everything crashing down. The more John dug, the more he uncovered not just about Leonard, but about the entire Matthews family. And as disturbing as it was, one thing became glaringly obvious. They had never expected someone like him to come after them. They'd thought that by now, the past would be buried, forgotten, but John wasn't just seeking the truth for his mother's sake, he was looking for revenge, for redemption, and for justice. The Matthews family had destroyed his life once, and he was determined that they would never do it again. It was a cold, dreary afternoon when John received an unexpected call that would change the course of his investigation. "John, it's Ruth," the voice on the other end said. Ruth was an old friend of his mother's, someone who had been there during Margaret's trial and had, at the time, provided emotional support. She was one of the few people who had never wavered in her belief that Margaret was innocent. But it had been years since they'd spoken, and the urgency in Ruth's voice was unmistakable. "I need to meet with you. I found something. Something big." John's heart skipped a beat. He had thought he was on his own in this fight. But if Ruth had uncovered something substantial, it could be the break he needed. The meeting was set for that evening, at a small, quiet cafe on the edge of town. The kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. Ruth was already there when John arrived, sitting in a booth near the back, a cup of coffee in front of her. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, still held the same fire he remembered from his childhood. John slid into the seat across from her. "Ruth, what is it? What have you found?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She took a long sip of her coffee and placed the cup back down slowly. Her fingers drummed nervously on the side of the mug. There was something she was holding back, something important. John could feel it. "I've been going through some old papers," Ruth began, her voice quiet but steady. "After you started asking questions, I started thinking about the trial again. About all the pieces that didn't fit, and I found something that could change everything." John leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" Ruth slid a manila folder across the table, its contents heavy with years of dust and forgotten history. John opened it slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Inside were a series of documents, witness testimonies, police reports, and a few photographs that John had never seen before. But there was one particular photo that caught his eye. It was a picture of a man, someone John had never seen before, but there was something oddly familiar about him. He was standing with Leonard Pierce. A younger version of both men, taken outside a building that John recognized as the old Matthews estate. They were shaking hands, exchanging something between them. There was no mistaking it, that two men had known each other long before Margaret's trial. "That man," Ruth said, her voice trembling now. "His name is Thomas Miller. He was a lawyer, someone connected to the Matthews family. And from what I've been able to piece together, he was the one who helped orchestrate your mother's conviction." John felt his stomach drop. "A lawyer? How did you?" "I found some old court documents," Ruth interrupted. "That listed him as part of a team of lawyers that worked on Victor Bellamy's case. The documents didn't say much, but it's clear that Miller was involved in the case from the very beginning. And he had connections with Leonard and Gerald Matthews. This was no ordinary trial, John. This was a setup. A conspiracy." John's mind was racing now. Thomas Miller. The name was unfamiliar, but Ruth's words made his blood run cold. It was no longer just a matter of Leonard and Gerald. There were others involved, people pulling the strings from the shadows. "How do you know this?" John asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Ruth hesitated before answering. "I've been talking to people who were there during the trial, old friends, acquaintances, and I found someone who remembered something, a meeting that took place the night before the trial. Leonard, Gerald, and this lawyer, Thomas Miller, they all met at the Matthews estate. They talked for hours, and no one knew what was discussed. But there were rumors about bribing the jury, about planting false evidence. Your mother never had a chance, John. It was all planned." John was in shock. His mind was reeling. For years, he had thought that the tragedy of his mother's conviction was simply a case of bad luck, of circumstances beyond their control. But now, he realized the truth. It had been orchestrated. Every piece of evidence, every witness, every moment, it had all been manipulated. "That's not all," Ruth continued, her voice growing quieter. "I found something else, something that connects Thomas Miller to your family. He's related to you, John. He's your uncle." John's head spun. "My uncle?" But how Ruth's face was pale, her expression somber. His sister was your grandmother, John, your mother's mother. She was married to a man named Edward Miller, who died under mysterious circumstances when Margaret was a teenager. Thomas Miller was your mother's half-brother. The Matthews family, they've been pulling the strings for generations. Your mother wasn't just the victim of a wrongful conviction. She was a pawn in a game much bigger than you could imagine. John felt the walls closing in on him. It wasn't just his mother's life that had been destroyed, it was his entire family. For decades, they had been manipulated, lied to, and kept in the dark about their own history. And now, with this new revelation, he had a chance to set things right. But there was a problem. Gerald Matthews was a dangerous man, and now he had even more to lose. As John sat there in the quiet cafe, the weight of his next steps pressed on him. He had to be careful, he had to outsmart them all. And then, the unthinkable happened. John's phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the silence. He glanced down at the screen, his heart stopping in his chest. The caller ID read, Gerald Matthews. John's hand trembled as he stared at the phone screen. Gerald Matthews, the man who had ruined his mother's life. The man who had woven a web of lies and deceit that had entangled their family for years. And now, the call was here, right at this moment, as if the universe itself was playing a cruel joke. He hesitated. Should he answer? Should he confront the monster directly, knowing that every word he spoke could either be his undoing or the key to unlocking everything? Before he could make a decision, the phone rang again. The sound sliced through the tension in the air, urging him to pick up. He pressed the answer button, swallowing hard, and brought the phone to his ear. John, Gerald's voice came through the line, smooth and deceptively calm. I think we need to talk. John's heart pounded in his chest. The nerve of the man. He had the audacity to call him, to pretend as if nothing had happened. But John wasn't the same man who had stood helpless in that courtroom years ago. He wasn't going to let Gerald manipulate him again. I'm listening, John said, his voice low and tight with restrained anger. I hear you've been asking a lot of questions lately, Gerald continued, his tone laced with a quiet threat. I thought we could clear the air before things get ugly. John fought to keep his voice steady. What's there to clear? You ruined my family's life, Gerald, my mother's life. You took everything from us. A pause on the other end, then a soft chuckle. Is that how you see it, John? How naive. You don't even know the half of it. John's mind raced. Was this just another manipulation? A way to make him doubt his own investigation? Tell me what you know, John pressed, his voice hardening. What exactly are you hiding, Gerald? Gerald's response was chilling. You really want to know? Fine, I'll tell you, but you won't like it. You think your mother was the victim of some terrible mistake, some horrible miscarriage of justice. But the truth is much darker than that. Your mother wasn't just a casualty in a battle she didn't understand. She was the cause of it. John felt a knot twist in his stomach. What are you talking about? Your mother, Gerald continued, the words deliberate and slow, was the one who betrayed us. She was the one who sold us out. John's head was spinning. Betrayed, sold out. Was Gerald really suggesting that his mother had been the villain all along? No, John said, shaking his head, even though Gerald couldn't see it. You're lying. My mother would never. I didn't say it was intentional. John, Gerald interrupted, his voice suddenly cold. But your mother knew exactly what she was doing. She knew about the arrangement, about the pact. Your mother was involved, and she made a choice that led to everything you've suffered. John's blood ran cold. He wanted to scream, to demand answers. But the words caught in his throat. He had always believed that his mother had been an innocent victim of a corrupt system. He had spent years mourning the loss of her freedom, her dignity. And now this, I don't believe you, John said, his voice cracking. What pact? What are you talking about? Gerald's laugh was devoid of humor. The Matthews family has been in power for a long time. John, we've made our share of deals. Deals that involve a lot of money, power, and control. Your mother got caught in the middle of it, and when she tried to back out, when she wanted to protect her family from what we were doing, well, she paid the price. But not before she made sure that you would be part of it too. John's world seemed to tilt. Was it possible? Could his mother have been involved in something so dark? He didn't want to believe it, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. I don't know what you're talking about, John said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. You're just trying to twist the story, just trying to cover your own tracks. Gerald didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a long, drawn-out breath, and then he said something that stopped John cold. If you want the truth, John, you'll have to come to me. You'll have to face the consequences of your mother's actions. I have everything you need. I have the evidence. Come to the Matthews estate, alone, no one else. If you're ready to learn the truth about your family, about your mother, you'll come. But understand this: once you step through those gates, there's no going back. You'll have to choose. Are you with me or are you against me? John's breath caught in his chest. The weight of the decision was heavy. He knew this was the moment when everything would be laid bare. He had to make a choice. Was he going to keep fighting, uncovering the truth, even if it meant destroying the last shreds of his family? Or was he going to walk away, to protect what little was left of his own sanity? But as he stood there, phone pressed against his ear, John made up his mind. He couldn't back down now. Too much had been uncovered. Too much had been sacrificed. He was going to confront this head-on. "I'll come," he said, his voice hard, resolute, "but you'll regret it. You'll regret this, Gerald." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then, finally, Gerald spoke again. "I'll see you soon, John. Prepare yourself." The line went dead. John stared at the phone in his hand, the finality of the conversation hanging in the air. His heart raced, his mind reeling. The Matthews estate, Leonard Gerald, his family's past, everything was about to come crashing down, and with it, the truth that would tear everything apart. But was he ready? Was anyone ever truly ready for the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their own family? John stood at the gates of the Matthews estate, his heart pounding in his chest. The looming mansion before him was everything he had imagined, a fortress of secrets, draped in centuries of wealth and power. The estate, nestled on the outskirts of New York, was more than just a house. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in his life. Everything he'd once believed about his mother, about his family, was crumbling in the face of the truth Gerald had all but forced him to confront. The gates creaked open as John stepped forward, a chill running down his spine. He'd been here before years ago, when he was a child, visiting on holidays, unaware of the shadows that lurked just beyond the surface. Back then, the Matthews family seemed untouchable. But now, standing here in the present, he realized just how wrong he had been. John had arrived alone. As instructed, he didn't trust Gerald. He wasn't sure if he could even trust his own instincts anymore, but there was no other way, no other path forward. "Welcome," a voice called from the shadows. John froze. Gerald stood there, framed by the light from the mansion's entrance. His face was eerily calm, almost a calm. His dark eyes gleamed, as if he was relishing the power he had over John in this moment. "I didn't think you'd come," Gerald said, his voice smooth and calculated. "But here you are." John said nothing, his body tense, his mind racing. What could he possibly say to this man? He had just learned that everything he thought he knew about his family was a lie. And now, Gerald was waiting for him to make his move. The mansion behind them seemed to close in on him, its towering walls a silent witness to whatever was about to happen. "I should have known better," John muttered. Finally, breaking the silence, "You always get what you want, don't you, even if it means destroying everyone in your path?" Gerald's smile widened. "Destroy? No, I'm simply ensuring things go according to plan. Your mother knew that." John's anger flared, but he held it in check. "Don't talk about my mother like you know her. Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Gerald said. Stepping forward, "You know what's at stake here. You've been digging into things you shouldn't have. You've poked around long enough. Now, you'll see the truth. The whole truth." John swallowed hard. He had no idea what to expect, but deep down, he knew this was the point of no return. "I came here for answers," John said, his voice steady despite the fury roiling inside him. "I want to know what really happened. I want to know why my mother was blamed for something she didn't do." Gerald raised an eyebrow. "You really think your mother was innocent, don't you? After everything, after all the lies she told, after all the decisions she made? You think she was just a victim? I can assure you, John, that's not how it works. She was a part of this whether she wanted to be or not." John's chest tightened. He wanted to shout, to demand the truth. But part of him, the part that had always idolized his mother, was terrified of hearing it. "I'm here for the truth. Gerald, no more games, no more lies," John said, his fists clenching at his sides. Gerald's eyes narrowed, his smile faltering for a brief moment. "Very well. If that's what you want, then I'll give it to you. But remember, this is what your mother signed up for." With a wave of his hand, Gerald gestured for John to follow him. John hesitated only for a second before stepping forward, following Gerald through the ornate front door of the mansion. The inside was just as imposing as the exterior. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and the air felt heavy with the weight of decades of secrets. They moved through several halls, passing portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow John with an unsettling intensity. Every step he took brought him closer to a truth that he wasn't sure he was ready for. Finally, they reached a large study, its floor-to-ceiling windows giving a clear view of the estate's sprawling grounds. The light from the chandelier overhead cast long shadows on the walls, making the room feel colder, more oppressive. Gerald motioned for John to sit, but he remained standing. Gerald's voice was low, almost a whisper, as he began to speak. "Your mother was never meant to get involved, but she did. And in doing so, she sealed her own fate. She was part of a project, you could call it, a deal we made. a way to secure our future. But when she tried to back out, it wasn't as simple as saying no. There are always consequences, John. For people like us, there are always consequences. John's mind spun as he listened to Gerald's words. A project? A deal? What was he talking about? How could his mother, the woman he had always known as kind, caring, and selfless, be involved in something like this? I'm not following, John said, his voice trembling. What project? What deal? Gerald sighed, leaning back in his chair. You're not seeing the full picture. Your mother was the one who had access. She was the one who could have stopped everything. The deal was never supposed to get out of hand, but she didn't play her part. She betrayed us. And when she tried to expose us, when she tried to protect you, she became a liability. So, we had to take action. John's stomach churned. Was this real? Was this the truth? Could his mother have been involved in something so sinister? It didn't make sense. You're lying. John spat. My mother never betrayed anyone. She was just trying to protect me. To protect us, Gerald's expression darkened. That's what she wanted you to believe. But the truth is far more complicated. She was part of a web much bigger than she realized. She made choices, John, and those choices led to your father's death, to her wrongful conviction. But it wasn't just the trial that got her sentenced. It was her knowledge of us, her knowledge of the family's dark dealings. And when she tried to run, we made sure she stayed silent. John stood frozen, his mind grappling with the weight of Gerald's words. His mother had been involved in the very thing she had always warned him against. Had she really been part of it? Or was this all a manipulation, a way to absolve Gerald of his own crimes? I don't believe you, John said, his voice shaking with emotion. You're just trying to twist everything to make yourself look like the victim. Gerald leaned forward, his eyes cold and calculating. I didn't make the rules, John. But now you're a part of this. There's no turning back. And in that moment, as John stood in the heart of the Matthews estate, with everything he thought he knew about his family unraveling before him, he realized one painful truth. There was no way out. The house felt like a prison now, every corner heavy with the unspoken truths John had just uncovered. Gerald's words echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else, the warmth of his childhood memories, the image of his mother's smiling face, the comfort he once found in the simple, familiar. It was all slipping through his fingers, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that threatened to consume him. For the first time in years, John questioned everything: his beliefs, his morals, his family's past. Had his mother really been complicit in all of this? Was Gerald right? Had she betrayed them all? The cold air inside the Matthews mansion seemed to freeze his thoughts. His heart, it was a place built on secrets, and it was suffocating him. You're still not getting it. Gerald's voice broke through the silence. His tone, a mix of impatience and amusement. Your mother made a choice, John, a decision that led to everything that followed. She was weak, but you don't have to be. You can fix this, if you're willing to see the bigger picture. John's jaw tightened. He couldn't sit here, listening to Gerald try to twist the story any further. There had to be more to this. There had to be something, anything that could redeem his mother's legacy. Something that would prove she wasn't the person Gerald was painting her to be. Enough, John finally shouted, standing up so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. I'm not going to listen to you anymore. You think you can control everything, don't you? You think you can make me believe that my mother was part of your twisted plans. But you're wrong. You're wrong about everything. Gerald's smile faltered for a moment, but it quickly returned, colder than before. You're still not ready, John. You still don't understand what's at stake. But you will. You're part of this now, whether you want to be or not. The tension between them grew thick, almost palpable. John could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his emotions swirling into a storm of anger, betrayal, and confusion. But something else was growing inside him, too. A small, quiet voice telling him to fight, telling him to take control of his destiny. Before it was too late. What's your plan, Gerald? John asked, his voice low and steady, his eyes never leaving the other man's. What exactly are you trying to do? What do you want from me? Gerald's expression darkened, his lips curling into a predatory smile. You know what I want, the same thing I've always wanted. Everything. The family business, the power, the control. Your mother didn't want to see it, but you. You can be the one who sees the bigger picture. You can be the one who takes what's rightfully ours. John's stomach churned at the thought. The idea of taking part in the Matthews empire, of becoming a cog in their machine, was repulsive. He'd always seen the family as something he could never be a part of, a legacy of greed, manipulation, and lies. But now, Gerald was offering him a chance to be something more, something bigger. He could feel his resolve starting to waver, and that terrified him. I'm not you, John said, his voice tight with emotion. I'm not like this. I won't play your game, and I won't become the person you want me to be. Gerald's face hardened, his smile replaced with an expression of cold fury. You think you have a choice? You think you can just walk away from this? I'll remind you, John, there's no running from your bloodline. No escaping what you were born into. The words stung, and for a moment, John faltered. He had always known there was something dangerous about the Matthews family, something dark, but hearing it laid bare like this made it feel even more real. This wasn't just a fight for his mother's honor, this was a fight for his own soul. You don't have to do this, John, Gerald said, his tone softening, almost coaxing. You don't have to struggle. All you need to do is step into your rightful place. Accept who you are. It will be easier for you in the long run. John's mind was racing, but he could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. What would happen if he rejected Gerald's offer? Would the entire Matthews empire turn against him? Would his life, the life he had tried so hard to rebuild after the tragedy, be torn apart by this man and his twisted schemes? The silence in the room was thick with tension. John felt trapped, cornered by his past, by the legacy he had inherited without even realizing it. But then, in the quietest of moments, something inside him snapped. No, John said firmly, his voice full of resolve. I won't be a part of this. I won't be your puppet. Gerald's face twisted in fury. And before John could react, Gerald lunged toward him. The force of the attack knocked John off balance, sending him crashing to the ground. Stubborn little fool, Gerald spat. You think you can defy me? You think you can walk away? John pushed himself up, his body aching from the impact. He barely had time to process what had happened before Gerald grabbed him by the collar, pulling him close, their faces inches apart. Listen to me, John, Gerald growled, his grip tightening. There's no escape. You're already in too deep. I can destroy you, and I will. If you want to keep your life, if you want to keep your future, you will do exactly what I say. John's heart raced, but his mind was clear. He couldn't back down now. He couldn't let Gerald win, couldn't let the Matthews family dictate his every move. With a surge of adrenaline, John shoved Gerald back, sending him stumbling toward the desk. He wasted no time, turning on his heel and sprinting toward the door. Gerald's voice echoed after him, filled with venom. You can't escape your destiny, John. You can't run from what you are. John didn't look back. He didn't need to hear Gerald's threats anymore. He had made his choice. As he stepped out of the mansion, the cool night air hit his face, grounding him. His heart was still pounding, his thoughts racing. But for the first time in years, he felt free. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was no longer willing to let the Matthews family control his fate. John knew the battle wasn't over. Gerald wouldn't stop until he had everything he wanted, but John had made his stand. And no matter what happened next, he wouldn't let fear dictate his life. With one last look at the Matthews estate, John turned away, ready to fight for his future. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time in his life, John felt like he was finally standing on his own. The morning after John left the Matthews mansion, he knew that his life would never be the same. The house loomed in the distance, like a dark reminder of everything he had tried to escape. Gerald's words still echoed in his ears, heavy and oppressive. But now, there was a quiet resolve in John, a determination to make things right, to finish what had been started long ago. The city felt different, too. The air, thick with the promise of change, weighed down on him as he walked through the streets. The once familiar streets of his youth seemed foreign now, stripped of their comfort. Every corner held a memory, a whisper of the past that he couldn't ignore. John knew what he had to do. He had to confront his mother. He needed to understand the truth, the full truth, about what had really happened all those years ago. There was no more running, no more hiding from the shadow of his family's sins. But that was easier said than done. His mother's house stood empty when he arrived. The windows dark, the door locked. John's heart sank. He had hoped that there would be someone, his mother, a neighbor, anyone to give him answers. But there was nothing. The silence was suffocating. He stood there for a moment, unsure of his next move. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn. And John felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of regret. Had he made the right decision? Had he done enough? Taking a deep breath, he turned away from the house, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. He couldn't afford to waste time. He had to find out the truth, even if it meant going to the one place he had avoided for so long. The prison. Inside the prison, the air was thick with a sense of dread, each corridor filled with echoes of lost souls, broken dreams, and shattered lives. John had been here before, but it had been a lifetime ago. The memories came rushing back, his mother's tearful face as she was taken away, the promise she had made to him that she would fight for the truth. But she had never returned. He walked down the long hall, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel eyes on him, the stares of inmates who had seen too much, heard too many stories. John tried to ignore them, but their presence was oppressive. Every step felt like a reminder of his own helplessness, his inability to protect the one person who had always been there for him. Finally, he reached the cell where his mother had been kept. It was empty now, cold, desolate. There was a small table by the window, papers scattered across it, but nothing that could give him the answers he needed. And then he saw a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. "John," it began, "if you are reading this, then you've found the truth about your heritage. I know you've been carrying the weight of this for years, but you must understand, I did what I had to do. I didn't want you to suffer because of the choices I made. But now you must know the whole story. It was never supposed to end this way. I never meant for you to be caught in the middle of all of this. Please forgive me." John's hands shook as he read the words. His mother's voice, her words, were coming from the past, reaching out to him. He could feel her pain, her regret, and he could almost hear the tremble in her voice. She had known the day would come when he would find out. And now, here he was standing in the place that had held her for so long, facing the truth he never wanted to hear. The truth about the family legacy, about her betrayal. He continued reading, "The man who took everything from us, from me, is not who you think he is. You will find the answers where you least expect them. You must go to him. Face him. Do what I could never do." John's mind raced. The man she was referring to was Gerald, wasn't it? The man who had tried to manipulate him, twist him into a puppet for his own gain. But why had his mother left him a message like this? Why had she waited so long to reach out when she had so many chances to explain herself? And what did she mean by "do what I could never do"? There was no time to waste. John folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He had to find out the rest of the story. He had to confront Gerald one last time. When he arrived back at the Matthews mansion, it was already dark. The gates were closed, but that didn't stop him. With one powerful push, he forced them open, stepping onto the property with a renewed sense of purpose. He wouldn't leave until he had the answers, until everything was exposed. The house loomed ahead, its windows glowing with the cold, yellow light of the lamps inside. But when John entered, he found the house eerily quiet, too quiet. He moved through the mansion, retracing the steps of his earlier confrontation with Gerald. The place had always felt like a prison, but now it felt even more suffocating. He could feel the weight of the family's sins pressing down on him, the past closing in, threatening to suffocate him once again. And then, there he was, Gerald, standing in the study, a glass of scotch in his hand, a cold smile playing on his lips. "You came back," Gerald said, his voice dark and amused. "I wondered how long it would take for you to realize that there's no running from this." John stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think I'm scared of you?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "I'm not afraid anymore. I'm here for answers." Gerald's smile faltered. "You don't want to know the truth, John. It'll destroy you. It'll tear everything you believe in apart." "Then I'll tear you apart first," John replied. "Tell me everything. Tell me what really happened." Gerald's face darkened, and for a moment, John could see the glint of something darker in his eyes. "You still don't get it," Gerald said, his voice suddenly cold and dangerous. "Your mother made a choice, just like I did. We're all part of this family's legacy. John, we can't escape it. You can't escape it." John's chest tightened as he stepped closer. "I'm done being part of your game, Gerald. Whatever twisted version of the truth you've created, I'm not buying it anymore. I'm here to finish this." Gerald laughed, a low, hollow sound. "You think this is the end? You think you can walk away?" "I'm already walking away," John said, his voice unwavering. "And I'll make sure you never have the power to hurt anyone else again." Gerald's smile twisted into something far more sinister. "You think it's that easy? You think I'll just let you walk away?" John's heart pounded, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He wasn't afraid of Gerald. He was afraid of what he might become if he didn't end this now. "You don't have a choice," John said, taking another step forward. Gerald lunged at him. But before he could reach John, there was a loud crack, followed by the sound of a gunshot. Everything went silent. The sound of the gunshot rang in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. John froze, his heart hammering in his chest, the sharp echo of the shot still reverberating in his ears. He looked at Gerald, his face twisted in a grotesque expression of disbelief. The older man staggered backward, a trickle of blood seeping from his chest. He collapsed to the ground, his hand clutching the wound as his breath came in ragged gasps. "Gerald," John whispered, his voice trembling as he took a step back. His eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the shot, and then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Catherine, her face, pale and drawn, was set with a determination John had never seen in her before. Her hands shook slightly as she lowered the revolver she had just fired, her breath coming in short, quick bursts. Her eyes locked onto John's, filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "I couldn't let you do it, John," Catherine said, her voice low but steady. "I couldn't let him destroy you too." John stood there, his mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. Catherine had saved him. No, she had saved both of them. But at what cost? Gerald gasped, blood pooling around him. You don't know what you've done, Catherine, what you've just started, he muttered, his voice strained, each word a struggle. Catherine's expression remained unreadable, her finger still resting on the trigger of the gun. It ends now, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You were never going to stop, Gerald, not until you destroyed everything we ever loved. John couldn't speak. The truth of Catherine's words sank in like a weight. This was it. The end of everything. The man who had haunted his family for so long, the man who had turned their lives upside down, was finally going to pay. But there was something in Gerald's eyes, something that John couldn't quite place, a look of defiance, of spite. Even as his life slipped away, he wasn't finished. You think you're done? Gerald gasped. A cruel smile twisting on his bloodied lips. There's still more. It's too late. Shut up, Catherine hissed, her voice breaking through the tension. She stepped forward, her hands trembling. It's over. It's finally over. But before either of them could react, Gerald's hand shot up, grabbing for something on the desk next to him. His fingers grazed the handle of a drawer just enough to pull it open, revealing something that made John's stomach drop, a folder thick, full of documents. Get away from it, John shouted, but it was too late. Gerald's last, desperate breath pushed out a final word before he collapsed completely. The will. A chill ran through John's spine as he darted forward, but Catherine was faster. She grabbed the folder from Gerald's desk with a swift motion and tore it open. Inside, there were papers, documents that looked official, legal. John's heart pounded as he snatched the papers from her hands. The last thing he wanted to do was give Gerald's games any more attention. But what did this have to do with the will? As he scanned the documents, his eyes locked on something chilling, something that made his blood run cold. In the event of my passing, the document went on, outlining a legacy that John had never been told about. There was mention of his father's name, his family's wealth, and assets, things that should have been John's inheritance, things he had never seen or known about. There was also a clause that stunned him to the core, an accusation that his mother had been part of the conspiracy to keep him away from his rightful inheritance. It made no sense. Gerald, he knew. John's voice broke as he realized the truth. His mother had been part of it all along. She had been working with Gerald, had been complicit in keeping John in the dark for so many years. But why? John muttered under his breath. Why? Catherine looked at him, her expression softening. She had been there for him throughout the pain. But this is truth. The legacy of betrayal was something neither of them could have anticipated. I don't know, John, but we need to figure this out. We need to make it right. You deserve the truth. You deserve to have what was taken from you, she said, her voice filled with determination. John stared at the papers in his hands. They weren't just legal documents, they were chains. Chains that had bound him to a past he couldn't change. He could feel the weight of them, the years of secrets and lies that had come to light in one cruel moment. Everything he had believed in, the truth about his family, his inheritance, was a lie. But now, the truth was his weapon, and he would use it. I don't know if I can forgive her, John said quietly, his eyes fixed on the papers, the weight of the revelation crushing him. I don't know if I can forgive any of them. Catherine's hand gently rested on his shoulder. You don't have to, but you deserve to know who you are. Who you really are. John looked up at her, a new determination settling in his heart. Catherine had been his rock through all of this, and now, more than ever, he knew she was the one person who truly understood him. Together, they would find a way to make things right. The next few weeks passed in a blur. John, Catherine, and the lawyer they had hired began the long, grueling process of untangling the web of lies that had been spun around John's life. They went through every document, every record, seeking out the truth that had been hidden for so long. And when it was all said and done, the pieces finally clicked together. John was the rightful heir to the Matthews estate, but the money and property meant nothing to him now. What mattered was the journey, the long road that had led him to this moment. He had confronted his past, faced the truths that had haunted him, and emerged stronger for it. But there was still one thing left to do. John went to his mother's grave. Standing before the stone, he whispered the words that had been building in his heart. I forgive you. The words were soft, but they held the weight of everything he had endured. Forgiveness wasn't for her, it was for him. And with that, the past was finally put to rest. The story of John's redemption spread throughout the town. He became a symbol of strength, of resilience in the face of betrayal. The Matthews name was no longer one of shame, it was a name he could carry with pride, having reclaimed his place in the world. And as for Catherine, she remained by his side, always. Together, they had faced the darkest parts of their lives, and, together, they had found the light.